Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Jeffrey Ostler, Professor in the Department of History. Jeff Ostler earned his BA at the University of Utah, his MA at the University of Oregon, and his PhD at the University of Iowa. He came to Oregon to teach in 1990. His research interests include the American West, America's political and environmental history, and the history of the American Indian. He is the author of 2 books, including The Plains, Sioux, and U.S. Colonialism from Lewis and Clark to Wounded Knee, published by the Cambridge University Press in 2004, and the recipient of the Caughey Western History Association Prize as the best book that year in Western U.S. history. He has 2 books in progress, The Question of Genocide in U.S. History, 1776 to 1890, and The Lakotas and the Black Hills, which will be published by Penguin. Jeff Ostler was recently named one of 20 Oregon scholars to receive awards from the newly established Fund for Faculty Excellence, designed to attract and retain world-class faculty members. Well, it's great to have you here, and congratulations on that very well-deserved award.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Steve. Yeah.
So the Penguin book, tell me about that. I mean, when you have a book published by Penguin, are you going to write that for a different kind of audience?
It's a different kind of book than anything I've written before. What I've written before has largely been for a scholarly audience, maybe students as well, but lots of footnotes and so on. And this is a book that Penguin is starting a new series in American Indian history. They're going to publish 10 or 12 books right away. Mine will be one of them. And the idea is to have short books that will be books that people, students and scholars will be interested in, but also the general public. Mm-hmm. So it's a different kind of writing than I've done before.
Have you started doing it?
I've started doing it, and I'm not sure how successful I am at doing the kind of writing that's required. It involves, I think, communicating a bit more straightforwardly, to be honest, than what
we're doing right now.
What scholars do sometimes. So,
yeah, not worrying about your footnotes, just trying to sort of say what's what.
Trying to make some straightforward points, not to dumb it down or something like that,
right.
But in a way to communicate across a little bit of a greater distance, but realizing that there's a lot of intelligent readers out there who will be interested in, are interested in American Indian history and in the subject that I'll be writing about, in particular, the Lakotas and the Black Hills.
Well, I was recently at an ACLS conference, and this is exactly what this American Council of Learned Societies for our audience of humanists. And one of the things that was the recommendation is that humanists learn actually fairly early in their career to learn how to communicate to a larger audience. And it has its virtues in terms of maybe getting us people understanding what we're doing, so maybe we could be better funded in the future.
Well, I think that there would be some real value in that. I mean, I wouldn't like to see a situation where that's sort of all that we did, because I do think that the more technical kinds of scholarly work that that we do engage in, all of us, at certain points in our career, are really quite critical to the building of knowledge through universities. But I think there's points in people's careers, and maybe all the way along, or certain venues and so forth, that these kinds of opportunities ought to be something that we do look for more, for the reasons that you say.
So you started off as an English major?
That's
that right?
Yeah.
And what made you make the shift into history, if you can recall?
Well, it was a long time ago. My memory is that a lot of the reason I was interested in literature, and as I read more literature in my late teens and early 20s in college, was I became interested in history through literature, so that, reading Thomas Hardy or something like that would make me interested in 19th century British history, what was going on with the Industrial Revolution and so on. And so, literature gives you some of that context, but I wanted more of that context, and it sort of led me in that direction.
What about the American West? When did you first start getting interested in the American West from a professional point of view?
Well, it was largely growing up in the American West, I guess, gave me my interest in it. And it was less an interest in the people of the American West so much as in the land, the landscape. And one of my early interests was in environmental history when that was becoming a field that people were talking about as a new field. It was kind of defined in the 1980s as a new field, and it's since become a major field with enormous literature and journals, but at that time it was just beginning. So that was kind of where my early interest in the American West started, was really with an interest in land and environment. And that then led to more of an interest in the diversity of the peoples and their history in that land.
So I guess we've had a history of, in the history department here, we've had a history of the study of the American West.
Yeah.
When you got your MA here, is that right?
I did, yeah.
And did the people who were teaching here have an influence on your career?
Yeah. The two people that I worked with the most are great scholars and teachers, both now retired. One of them was Edwin Bingham, who's known as Bingham, and he retired now a little over 20 years ago, but I was fortunate to work with him in my years, 2 years as a master's student here. And then Richard Maxwell Brown, who held our endowed chair in Western history, the Beekman Professorship at that time. And so I worked closely with both of them, and they had interests in the kinds of things I was interested in, but they also expanded my interests a great deal. Bingham was very knowledgeable about American cultural and intellectual history in particular, and Dick Brown was especially knowledgeable about the history of violence in America, which has had an effect on my development, and also the history of politics.
So when did you make the turn towards, or maybe it wasn't a turn, towards Native American?
Well, when I first came here in 1990, it was really through my teaching. I had, as I say, had been interested in environmental history. I became interested in political history. And when I started teaching, I realized that it was increasingly important to talk about a history of all of the people of the American West, and that critical to that was the history of American Indians. And so it was really through my teaching that in part it was recognizing a deficiency in my own understanding, and then as I began to remedy that deficiency, I became interested myself in doing some research on some particular issues in American Indian history, particularly about the Lakota Sioux.
So how did you find the quality of the work on the American Indian when you started becoming professionally interested in it? Was it a wide open field?
Well, there's a lot that's been written. I mean, it has a very deep, it has a deeper and more complex historiography than probably people realize. And real strong generalizations about that historiography are often misleading. There's been a lot of people a long ways back who wrote, largely outsiders, non-Indians, who wrote about Indian history with some real understanding and sensitivity. Having said that, though, probably up until the 1970s or so, a lot of what was written from a kind of dominant culture perspective that retained in one way or another some of the narratives about Indians that were created during the period of colonialism, and reflected, in certain ways at least, some of the notions of Indians as primitive savages, and then strictly, sometimes with the sympathetic perspective, but strictly as victims and so on. And right when I started, things had begun developing in a different direction, and there has been a kind of flourishing of studies in American Indian history in the last 20 or so years, which I've kind of been carried along, drafting a bit, as it were, with that. And the emphasis has been more on Indian people as real actors or agents in their own history, on the survival of Indian people, the fact that Indian people are still here, an emphasis on the 20th century, more than just an older history that suggests that Indians are only a part of our past and so on. So those are some of the themes that we're developing. There were a lot of opportunities, it seemed to me, but there was also a lot going on.
Tell us, if you will, if you can chart the drift of your career from your book on the Sioux to what you're working on now. That is this question of genocide, which is a very charged word.
Yeah.
And as we're going to be looking at the next, at our conference,
Right,
it has a
right.
very peculiar history to it. So, how did you tell us how you got from your work on the Sioux, this 2004 Cambridge book, to the work on genocide?
I started thinking about genocide more as a general issue in American history when I was finishing my book on the Plain Sioux. The book ends, or doesn't quite end, but it culminates with the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where the Army killed a bit more than 300 Sioux at Wounded Knee, and of course that massacre is quite well known to most people. Because that massacre had been talked about as an instance of genocide, and because it had some of those characteristics to it, although I didn't directly address that issue as such in the book, I began to think about it. And so, I've begun to think about the issue more generally in American history.
So, what other genocides? When you talk about genocide in American history, give us some other examples of it, and if you will, I guess it's not that difficult to define, but if you could define it for us. In fact, maybe it's not that easy to define what genocide is.
Well, as I've tried to learn more about genocide as a phenomenon and scholarly and public discussions of genocide, it does turn out actually that one of the most contentious issues in genocide studies is defining genocide and what really counts as genocide and what doesn't. And there are many different definitions. The current international legal definition, as I'm sure you're aware, is from the UN Convention on Genocide of 1948, which is in many respects very broad. It includes 5 different things that can qualify under the general category of an intent to destroy a national or racial or ethnic group. And some of those things don't involve necessarily even killing. For example, one of the items under the UN definition involves efforts that cause, or activities or actions that cause bodily and mental harm to members of a group. And so, that allows for rather capacious inclusion of different kinds of events or series of events or episodes under genocide.
It doesn't have to involve murder.
It doesn't, under the UN definition. Now, there are scholars, though, who work in the area who would argue for a more limited definition that would focus primarily on massive physical destruction of groups of people. Another thing under the UN definition, for example, would involve efforts to take children out of a group, or efforts to limit the capacity of a group to reproduce itself. And those don't involve direct physical extermination of living people. So some people want to narrow that. So it is contentious. Sorry.
No, that's fine. To come back to the side part of the CIDE part of genocide, I'm sorry to interrupt you, so that while it doesn't necessarily have to involve the killing of an individual human being, it's the killing of the race, of the genus,
of the group,
right? And so, or an attempt to kill the group by doing various things, as you mentioned, such as putting people in boarding schools and But I'm sorry, I interrupted you. If you remember where you were going.
Well, that's okay. The real point that I'm making here is just that the definitional question is quite contentious and probably ultimately unresolvable. I'm sure that if people continue to think about this issue, hopefully without the phenomenon continuing to occur as in our lives, but as we continue to think about it, hopefully more as a historical phenomenon, the question of definition will continue to be there, I think. In my own thinking, the project that I have in mind, which I'm at an early stage on, is to kind of think about the question of genocide in American history from the Declaration of Independence, essentially up to 1890 or so, up to Wounded Knee. I'm proceeding with a fairly conservative definition in mind, which would emphasize the physical killing or physical loss of life of people, so that I'm thinking of genocide a little bit more narrowly than the UN Convention. I do think that there's other things going on that I do want to talk about that involve the destruction or undermining of the integrity of Indian communities' cultures and ways of life and so on, which is clearly going on. But I want to, in my own mind, I think analytically separate those two kinds of things.
So are you focusing on the American Indian community? Are there other forms of genocide that people talk about in American culture?
It's a good question. I mean, I have decided, at least for the moment, to focus strictly on the American Indian situation. There are arguments, and I may wind up addressing them, that, for example, slavery, and particularly the slave trade, involves genocide. So to the extent that the United States is involved in that transatlantic phenomenon, that there's an issue of genocide to be talked about in our history there as well. But I'm not really, in my work, going to take it up at the task of sort of trying to deal with the entire continent for over 100 years is a bit daunting. I wish I was 10 years younger, and maybe I would have a chance of making progress faster on that.
Do you feel comfortable using the word genocide? Is that a controversial issue in regard to the American Indian in American history and in writing about American history?
Well, it is. It's not as big of a controversy as genocide in the past in some other national histories. It's recently become very controversial, of course, in Australia, Turkey, and so on. It's less so, I think, a part of our public national consciousness and debates. But you know, if you remember at the time of the Columbus quincentenary in '92, there was quite a bit of talk about genocide. I remember I was actually, it so happened, in New York on Columbus Day of '92 and witnessed a protest in front of the UN where you know, people were protesting against the sort of celebratory atmosphere of Columbus, and some of the speakers were using the term genocide, and there were signs that were being held up, you know, remember a history of genocide, and genocide occurred here, and that kind of thing. And so there is certainly an argument that's out there that affects the academy, that affects segments of the general public, that yes, genocide is a part of American history. But I'd say that largely mainstream scholars, and probably most segments of the general public, wouldn't particularly think that that's the case, or even think a great deal about that issue.
That what's the case?
That there is a fairly pervasive history of genocide in the American past. Most people wouldn't really think that, I think.
Exactly. So what do you do to? What about your students, for example? When you mention genocide in America?
Most of them, although not all, I think are inclined to think that probably not. Not always, or not entirely. And I do think it's a complicated issue. I don't think it's a straightforward issue by any means. And so that's part of what I hope to do in a book, is to both take the issue of genocide seriously in our national past, because I think that it is a real issue, but to also do so in such a way that isn't overly polemical or doesn't create an idea that there's a kind of absolute and total constant genocide always going on. I think that when you have a situation like you do in the Americas, of European colonialism unfolding over a very long period of time, with many, many different Indian communities, lots of different agendas. Indian communities in some situations have the capacity to avoid certain kinds of actions that might result in massive loss of life, but don't right then, because some of them are armed at times, they're able to flee, they're in their own territory and so on. So I think it's a much more complicated situation than has sometimes been argued for.
What's the advantage to calling it genocide? What do you find in terms of the American Indian, for example? Why do we need that word? Because you yourself are talking about how you have to be very careful to not create a sort of McCarthy atmosphere or whatever, where you've got some slogans that are not really getting to the issue. Tell me why you think that the word genocide is particularly appropriate, and if you could, its relation, say, to Australia or to Turkey, which our audience may not be aware of.
Well, part of it, I think, has to do with a sense that I have that there is in general public consciousness, and I'd say this across political spectrums and so on, and also among scholars, I think, as well, that United States history is different than histories of other parts of the world. And I've always had a sense that that is less true than people think. And I think that there's value for us. I think it's important for us, not just as scholars, but as citizens of the United States, to think kind of against that. And so I think that we have a history that has more in common with other colonial histories. And those histories themselves have more in common with histories that involve what we do recognize, or more widely accepted anyway, as involving genocide in this sense.
So this idea of the shining city on the hill and American exceptionalism, and there's somehow something very special about America, can, in a sense, create an atmosphere where certain crimes are committed in a way that people aren't aware of.
Aren't aware of, and I think that it's important for us not to do this in a way that is unnecessarily divisive, or that involves lots of name calling and accusations of being a denier and this kind of thing, but that we more soberly kind of reckon with the reality of historical injustices in our history. And to some extent this has happened. I think that if we look at the last 20, 30 years, to some extent longer, but let's say that period of time, I think that there has been an ability on the part of Americans to look at some episodes in our past more soberly. Certainly that's true of Japanese internment, for example. In some ways, it's less true of the situation with the history of the United States relations with American Indians.
Well, let me ask you, because I'd say 10, 15 years ago, in high schools and so on, this became a sort of culture war issue. The people who were represented fairly or unfairly as dumping on American history by bringing up these things. And then, I guess you could say on the other side, the manifest destiny point of view and so on. So has the tone of that debate changed very much? And do you still have the people who are kind of saying, you're dragging the United States through the mud with this kind of inquiry?
Well, it's hard for me to say. I don't follow this any more closely than anybody else, and I don't know what your impression would be. My impression, just having lived through the post 9/11 years, is that the post 9/11 environment, for a little while, I think, did accentuate sensitivity to criticism of America. But my sense also is that some of that is waning a little bit. And my sense, too, is that hopefully some of the people who are asking us to think more critically, but in a sober way about our past, are suggesting that we do that in more nuanced and constructive ways.
So where would you place Samantha Power, who's going to be a speaker at our conference? Where would you place her in the debate on genocide today? I mean, how important a figure is she, say, in your work or in people who work on this notion of genocide?
Well, her book is certainly very important, and I think especially to people who think about 20th century genocides, and particularly people who think about the ongoing phenomenon of genocide and what we're going to do about it. And this is something that I have myself special insight on, so I look to people like her and others, you know, who might not necessarily agree with her on everything for guidance in those areas. You know, my work, since it's really 19th century and is related to American history. I mean, in Samantha Power's book, there's a serious indictment of America for not doing more in the 20th century to prevent genocide elsewhere.
Right.
There's not really a sense in the book that America might have in its own history a genocidal past to reckon with.
Yeah, very, very good point. Maybe the two go together.
Well, it's possible that there's a kind of, and this would relate to this issue of American exceptionalism. One aspect of that is a sense that America has had and needs to continue to have a special mission to the world to stop evil elsewhere. This, you know, this city on a hill notion that you brought up, it carries that kind of moral purpose, or moral mission in the world. So.
But if you're not looking inside for genocide, then I guess you're not going to. I mean, you're not going to. I mean, it's maybe omitted from that book because people haven't wanted to look inside and see what was going on here. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think that's true. I think that people generally have not wanted to look so much at the American past on this issue.
Well, Jeff Ostler, it's been great to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say at our conference.
Thanks very much, Steve.
We've been speaking with Jeff Ostler, professor of history. Thank you for being with us.